Have you ever felt completely empty while your life looked perfectly fine from the outside? This story is about why that happens and what breaks it. Daniel hadn't cried in 11 years. He'd counted. Not because nothing hurt, but because somewhere along the way he had decided that feeling things was the same as losing control. And Daniel never lost control. That was his greatest achievement, or so he believed, until the night everything inside him went completely quiet, and the silence was louder than anything he had ever heard. This is a story about what happened when Daniel finally opened the door he'd kept shut for a very long time. A story about thoughts and stories and the life we build without realizing we are the architect. A story about a man who changed his thinking and in doing so changed everything else. He was 32 years old. He worked as a writer, a good one. He wrote articles, campaigns, long pieces for publications that paid well. He was disciplined. He woke at 6 every morning. He exercised. He answered his emails within the hour. He had a 5-year plan written in a leather notebook on his desk, with neat bullet points and quarterly goals. From the outside, Daniel's life looked exactly the way a life is supposed to look. From the inside, it felt like wearing a suit that fit perfectly, but wasn't actually his. He'd had a relationship that ended 8 months before this story begins. Her name was Clara. She had said something on their last night together that Daniel had heard but never really let himself absorb. She said, "You're always here, Daniel, but you're never actually present." He'd nodded, said he understood, helped her carry her things to the car with steady hands, closed the door, went back to his desk, opened his laptop, worked until 2 in the morning. He didn't cry. He'd gotten very good at that. The breaking point when it came wasn't dramatic. It was a Wednesday afternoon. Daniel was sitting in a coffee shop with his notebook, trying to write. He had been trying for 3 hours. Nothing came. He looked out the window at the street. A man laughed at something his phone said. A woman held a child's hand, swinging their arms. A small boy ran ahead of his mother, just running for no reason at all, just to feel his legs move. Daniel watched that boy and felt something crack open inside his chest. Not because anything was sad, but because he realized he could not remember the last time he had done anything for no reason. Could not remember the last time he had felt something he hadn't immediately filed away, explained, or pushed down before it could settle. He closed his notebook. He went home. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. And for the first time in 11 years, Daniel let himself cry. He wasn't even sure what he was crying about. That was the most frightening part. There was no single reason. It was everything at once, and also nothing he could name. It felt like his body had been keeping a secret and had finally decided to let him in on it. He cried for a long time. Then he felt something he didn't expect. He felt a little lighter. The next morning, his neighbor knocked on his door. Marcus was a retired professor. He read constantly, spoke slowly, and never seemed to be in a hurry, the kind of man who seemed to carry time differently from everyone else. He brought coffee. He did this sometimes for no reason. They sat at Daniel's kitchen table. Marcus looked at him for a quiet moment and said, "You look like a man who spent last night in a fight." "With myself," Daniel said. "Who won?" Daniel almost laughed. "I don't know yet." Marcus reached into the bag he'd carried in and placed a book on the table between them. I don't read self-help, Daniel said. This isn't self-help, Marcus said. This is self-honesty. There's a difference. Daniel opened the book that night without any particular hope. By 3 in the morning, he had stopped reading and was simply staring at the ceiling. Because the book had said something he couldn't unhear. The life you are living is not the result of the things that happened to you. It is the result of the story you decided to tell about those things. He read it 3 times. He thought about Clara. He thought about why every close relationship in his life eventually reached the same invisible wall. He thought about why he couldn't write anymore. Why he woke up each morning with a low, quiet dread he had always called just being tired. He had always believed his stories. The story that said you have to stay in control or everything falls apart. The story that said feeling things deeply is weakness. The story that said if you work hard enough and look successful enough, the emptiness will eventually go away. He had believed these stories so completely that he had never once thought to question them. They weren't things he had chosen. They were things he had absorbed from old experiences, old wounds, old moments in childhood, when he had learned that being too open was the same as being too exposed. But now, lying in the dark, he asked himself a question he had never asked before. What if the story is wrong? In the days that followed, Daniel began to pay attention in a way he never had. He noticed that whenever something made him anxious, his first instinct was to immediately solve it. Fix it. Make the feeling disappear as fast as possible. He had trained himself to be a machine of management, moving through discomfort so quickly that the discomfort never had time to speak. But the book said something that stopped him cold. What you resist will persist. The emotion you refuse to feel doesn't disappear. It grows roots. He thought about all the things he had refused to feel over the years. The grief he had never processed. The anger he had always swallowed before it reached his face. The loneliness he had quietly renamed independence. He had suppressed so much that in doing so, he had also suppressed the good thing, the joy, the warmth, the sense of wonder that makes ordinary mornings feel like something worth waking up for. He had been so busy managing his feelings that he had forgotten how to actually have them. He started a new practice. Small, uncomfortable, strange. When a feeling came, he didn't run. He sat with it. He let it be there. He said to himself, quietly, like someone learning a new language, "This is fear. This is grief. This is longing." And then he waited, the way you wait out rain without trying to stop it. It was harder than any work he had ever done. But slowly, very slowly, something began to shift. Marcus came by again a week later. Daniel had questions. Too many to organize neatly, which was unusual for a man who organized everything neatly. The book talks about how we think we are our thoughts, Daniel said, but we're not. We're the ones watching them. How does that actually work? Marcus poured his coffee and thought for a moment. When you were crying last week, he said, were you the sadness? Or were you the person who was experiencing the sadness? Daniel went still. You were aware of it, Marcus continued, which means there was a part of you that was separate from it, watching it, feeling it, yet, but not entirely consumed by it. That is what the book is pointing to. Your thoughts are like clouds. You are the sky. Daniel sat with that for a long time. He had spent 32 years believing he was the clouds. believing that every anxious thought was a fact about reality, that every fearful thought was a true prediction of what would happen next, that every dark thought meant something real about who he was. But thoughts aren't facts. Emotions aren't facts. They are information, signals, weather moving through. The question was never whether the clouds would come. The question was whether he would mistake himself for them. He is not his thoughts. He is the one who notices them. This was perhaps the first real shift. He went back to his writing after that, but differently. Before, writing had been a performance. He had written to seem smart, to impress, to fill his days with productivity so he would never have to be alone with himself. Busyness had been his hiding place, the most socially acceptable hiding place there is. He had confused being busy with being productive. He had confused productivity with purpose. He had filled every hour and still felt hollow, because none of it was coming from a real place inside him. Now he tried something new. He wrote honestly, without the performance, without first calculating how it would land or what people would think. It was terrifying. It was also the best writing he had ever done. He started to notice something about the way he had been reading his own life. The book called it this: cognitive distortions, twisted lenses, the mind's habit of bending reality just enough to match the stories we already believe. He saw it now in his own thinking. When someone didn't reply to his message, he assumed he had said something wrong. When he made a mistake at work, he turned it into evidence that he was fundamentally not good enough. When something went right, he explained it away. Luck, timing, someone else's generosity. His mind had been building a case for years, collecting evidence to support the oldest story, that he was not quite enough, and that it was only a matter of time before everyone else figured it out. The book named this too. It called it the performance of earning worthiness, the exhausting attempt to prove through results and achievements and perfect behavior that you deserved to take up space in the world. But worthiness, the book said quietly, is not something you earn. It is something you already have. It does not come at the end of the accomplishment. It is not waiting for you on the other side of the goal. It was there before the first thing you ever achieved, and it will be there if you achieve nothing for the rest of your life. Daniel read that 3 times too. He did not believe it yet. But he kept it close, the way you keep a question you are not ready to answer. He noticed something about his self-sabotage too. The book had a name for it. Self-sabotage, it explained, is not self-destruction. It is self-preservation. We don't destroy good things because we are broken. We destroy them because they are unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things feel dangerous to us even when they are good. The comfort zone is not a place that feels comfortable. It is a place that feels familiar. There is a real difference. We stay in bad situations, bad jobs, bad relationships, old habits that hurt us, not because they feel good, but because they feel known. And the known, no matter how painful, feels safer to the nervous system than the unknown. Daniel thought about every opportunity he had quietly let slip past, every relationship he had pushed away at exactly the moment it began to go deep, every creative project he had abandoned just before it could succeed. He hadn't been lazy. He hadn't been unlucky. He had been afraid of the unfamiliar. And in his fear, he had always chosen the pain he recognized over the joy he hadn't felt yet. About 3 weeks in, Daniel almost gave up. He had been doing the inner work, sitting with feelings, questioning his stories, writing honestly. but nothing seemed to have changed on the outside. He still felt lost. He still woke up with the quiet dread. He still didn't know what his life was supposed to become. He called Marcus late one night, which wasn't something he normally did. "I'm doing everything," he said. "Feeling my feelings, questioning my thoughts. I'm still in the same place. When does it actually change?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Daniel," he said, "you can't think your way into a new life. You have to act your way into new thinking." Daniel didn't understand at first. "You've been waiting for the understanding to come before you move," Marcus said. "But it doesn't work that way. You have to move first. The understanding follows action, not the other way around." He had been sitting still, waiting to feel ready, waiting to feel certain enough to begin. But readiness doesn't come before the beginning. It comes because of the beginning. Daniel put down the phone. He looked at the blank page in front of him. He started. He started calling old friends he'd drifted away from because closeness had always felt like a risk. He started taking walks with no destination. He started saying yes to things that scared him and no to things that were only familiar. He made mistakes. He had awkward conversations. He said the wrong thing sometimes. But he was moving, and something remarkable was happening. The more he moved into the unfamiliar, the more he began to understand himself. Not by thinking, by doing, by living, by letting his actual experience teach him what his thoughts never could. The book had said something about happiness that he now understood differently. Happiness is not the absence of problems, it is the ability to deal with them. He had spent his whole life trying to create a problem-free existence, organizing and managing and controlling so nothing could catch him off guard. But the problems never stopped. They just changed shape. The question was never how to have no problems. The question was who he wanted to be while he had them. One afternoon, he ran into an old colleague named Rhea. She had always seemed effortlessly at ease with herself, the kind of person he had found slightly intimidating for reasons he couldn't name. They got coffee. For the first time in a long time, Daniel didn't perform. He didn't edit himself before speaking. He just spoke. He told her about the past weeks, about the emptiness, the crying, the book, the slow and messy work of trying to understand himself. She listened, and then she said something that stayed with him. "You know what I always noticed about you? You were always trying to seem like someone who had it figured out. But the people who have actually figured things out, they're never trying to seem like anything." He walked home thinking about that for a long time. The book had talked about this, about how we perform lives instead of living them, about how we build a version of ourselves designed to be admired, and then wonder why we feel so alone. Because the person being admired isn't really us. It's the character we constructed. And you cannot genuinely connect with another person through a mask. You can be applauded through it, you cannot be loved through it. He had been admired for years, and he had been profoundly alone. Not lonely, exactly. He understood the difference now. Loneliness is the pain of isolation. Aloneness is simply being with yourself. You can be alone without being lonely. But you can also be surrounded by people and feel deeply lonely. Because no one in the room knows who you actually are. Daniel had lived in that second kind of alone for most of his adult life. Here is the question Daniel asked himself at the hardest moment of all of this, the moment when everything he thought he knew about himself was in question. If the version of me I've been showing the world isn't really me, then who am I? He sat with that for days. It is the most frightening question a person can ask because the answer isn't already sitting somewhere inside you, fully formed, waiting to be found. The answer has to be built, chosen, decision by decision, built through paying attention to what you actually feel when no one is watching, what you actually love when no one is judging, what actually matters to you when the performance is over and the room is quiet. The book called this the shadow self, the parts of us we have hidden away, not because they are bad, but because we were once told they were unwelcome. The sensitive boy who learned to be hard, the creative person who learned to be practical, the honest voice that learned to stay quiet. These hidden parts don't disappear. They go underground, and from underground, they shape our choices without us knowing it. Real wholeness, the book said, doesn't come from removing these parts. It comes from bringing them back into the light, from acknowledging them, from saying, yes, this is also me. Identity isn't something you discover. It's something you integrate. For the first time, that felt like freedom rather than burden. He thought about the people he had tried to love over the years. Clara, others before her. The book made a distinction he had resisted at first, then couldn't unsee. There is a difference between loving someone and needing someone. Dependency dresses itself as love. It arrives with urgency and intensity. It says, I need you. Without you, I am not complete. But underneath that intensity is fear. The fear of being alone with yourself. The fear that you alone are not enough. Real love comes from a person who already has something inside, already feels whole, and simply wants to share that wholeness with another. It doesn't grip. It doesn't cling. It doesn't need the other person to be something in particular. Daniel had never learned to feel whole alone, so everything he had called love had really been a search for the completeness he hadn't built inside himself. And the people he'd been with had felt it. You can feel when someone needs you to complete them. It's heavy. Love isn't supposed to carry that weight a few months into this slow and difficult and quietly beautiful process. Daniel sat down to write something he had been afraid to write for years. It was the most personal piece he had ever attempted. A story about a person who built walls and called them boundaries, who stayed busy and called it purpose, who managed his emotions and called it strength. He wrote it in one long sitting through the night. When he finished, he read it back. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. He sent it out without softening every sharp edge into something safe and acceptable. 3 days later, a publication wrote back. They said it was the most honest thing they had read in months. He sat at his desk and read that message, and he felt something he almost didn't recognize. Pride, not the performance kind, not the kind that comes from impressing people. The quiet, private kind, the kind that comes from doing something true. Marcus came for coffee one last time, a few weeks before winter arrived. They sat by the window and watched the street settle into the late afternoon. Tell me what you know now, Marcus said, that you didn't know before. Daniel took his time. I know that my feelings aren't facts, he said. They're real. They matter. But they're not the truth about the world. They're signals about me. Marcus nodded slowly. I know that the stories I tell myself about who I am are more powerful than my actual experiences, because the story decides what I do with the experience. Yet, yeah, I know that the life I want doesn't come from figuring everything out first. It comes from taking a step before I'm ready, from action, from movement, from doing. even while I'm afraid." He paused. "And I know that what I was calling strength, the control, the suppression, the performance, wasn't strength at all. It was armor. Good armor, maybe. Armor that kept me safe for a long time, but armor that also kept everything out, including the things worth letting in." Marcus looked at him for a quiet moment. "And the crying?" he asked. "The man who hadn't cried in 11 years?" Daniel looked out at the street, at the ordinary, beautiful world that had always been there, waiting for him to notice it. "That man thought not feeling things made him powerful," he said. "But the truth is, you can't choose which feelings to close off. You close off pain, you close off joy, you block sadness, you block love. You numb one end, and you numb the whole thing." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't want to be numb anymore," he said. "I'd rather feel everything than nothing." That winter, Daniel changed his life. Not all at once, not dramatically, not with some grand gesture that looked impressive from the outside. He changed it the way real change always happens, quietly, in the small choices no one else sees. He stopped chasing approval in his work and started chasing honesty. He stopped filling his calendar to escape himself and started leaving space to simply be. He stopped asking, "What will people think?" and started asking, "What do I actually believe?" He began to understand what the book meant when it said that the questions you ask yourself shape the reality you build. Ask, "Why does this always happen to me?" And your mind will spend its energy finding evidence that you are a victim. Ask, "What can this teach me?" And your mind will spend its energy finding the lesson. Same life, completely different experience. Because of the question you choose. He let people close again. Not all the way, not overnight. But he stopped closing the door at exactly the moment connection was becoming real. He stayed. He risked. He was sometimes hurt, and he didn't use that hurt as proof that openness was a mistake. One afternoon in early spring, he was walking through the city with no destination, something he now did often, when he passed a glass storefront and caught a brief glimpse of his own reflection. He almost didn't recognize himself. Not because he looked different, because he carried himself differently. The tightness was gone, the invisible armor had loosened enough to let him breathe. He stood there for a moment. He thought about the man he had been on that Wednesday afternoon in the coffee shop. Watching the boy run for no reason. Feeling something crack open in his chest. He understood now what had cracked. It wasn't grief. It wasn't despair. It was a door. And through that door, after all the work and all the fear and all the slow and imperfect becoming, on the other side was simply this: a man who was starting, at last, to be at home in himself. Daniel never became perfect. He still had bad days. He still overthought sometimes. He still caught himself building walls and had to remind himself to put down the bricks. He still confused his feelings with facts sometimes and had to stop and ask, "Is this true, or is this just the old story talking?" But he had learned something he could not unlearn. You don't need to fix yourself. You need to understand yourself. Fixing assumes you are broken. Understanding assumes you are human. There is a profound difference between those two things. One is a war, the other is a conversation. He picked up the old leather notebook, the one with the 5-year plan, neat and organized. He looked at it for a long time. Then he turned to a blank page. He wrote 3 words. Not a plan, not a goal, not a projection of what his life should look like in someone else's eyes. 3 words that held everything he had learned in that long, hard, quietly beautiful year. Be here first. He didn't know what the next 5 years would hold. Didn't know what his work would become or who he would love or where the road was going, but he knew who was making those decisions. Not the performance, not the armor, not the story he had inherited without ever questioning it. Him, the real one. The one who had cried in the dark and survived it. The one who had stopped running from himself long enough to find out what was there. And what was there? Underneath all the management and the masks and the long years of keeping feelings at a careful distance, what was there was simply a man. Imperfect, open, present, enough. 11 years of silence broken by one night of tears, one book, one neighbor with coffee and patience, one very long conversation with himself that he had been postponing since he was young. Daniel hadn't changed the world. He had changed his relationship with it. And perhaps that is the only change that has ever truly mattered. Because the world you experience is always, in the end, a reflection of the story you are telling about who you are, what you deserve, and what is possible. Change the story. The world changes with it. The room inside him, the one that had felt like no one had entered in years, wasn't empty anymore. He had walked in. He had turned on the light, and he had decided finally to stay.